Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 6. I'll begin by addressing some theoretical and practical issues related to archival research before turning to content and discourse analysis as useful methods that can be used dealing with any text, archival or otherwise. I want to start by recalling a point I made in my Week 3 video lecture concerning the institutional power of the archive. Historically, the modern institution of the archive is intrinsically bound to the legitimation of state power. One of the first acts of the French revolutionary government, for example, was to establish a national archives. Like other modes of record-keeping, such as the census and map-making, the archive was a product of statecraft, as the collation of state-produced documentation was part of the larger process to make society increasingly more legible and administration more rationally ordered. For the new, modern class of professional historians, the archives were assumed to be repositories of objective facts, and only they had the proper training and discipline to collect and review such carefully kept documentation. In that way, official archives operated at what the French philosopher Michel Foucault called the knowledge-power nexus, insofar as these institutions essentially laid down the law, figuratively, if not literally, in terms of determining what was knowable and sayable in terms of historical knowledge. In other words, as traditionally conceived, the archives have tended to determine what is quote-unquote worth knowing. On a more practical level, it's important to understand that archives are institutions that wield significant, if hidden, forms of power. For example, the holdings of archives represent the priorities and prerogatives of the archives. Like publishers who publish books they judge will sell, archivists tend to accept collections they think socio-historical researchers will actually use for research. Archivists gladly accept the papers of distinguished and well-known individuals, as such collections usually lend prestige to archives, and to the archivists who successfully encourage such donations. In this way, archives mirror the societies in which they are embedded. The papers of privileged and institutionally powerful people are far more likely to be accepted by archives than are donations of quote-unquote lesser men and women. The institutional power of archives doesn't end there, as there are unique spatio-temporal constraints. Physical access to archival repositories is restricted, sometimes very tightly. Gaining physical entry to an archive is an obvious but fundamentally necessary prerequisite. Permission to enter an archive is either prearranged or later confirmed upon arrival, or is granted outright during the orientation interview. Curators, who are rightly concerned about theft, vandalism, and needless wear and tear on irreplaceable materials, can, and sometimes do, deny entry. The crucial point is that access to archival repositories is not guaranteed. Moreover, the donors of archival materials, as well as their heirs and/or literary executors, frequently retain private property rights over materials deposited in their archives. In some cases, donors permit materials to be used only by scholars who receive the approval of the donor or their estate. Finally, archival materials are usually stored in restricted areas or closed stacks to which patrons are almost always denied physical access. Researchers must request materials for use, and this provides a mechanism by which archivists monitor the nature and quantity of materials consulted by researchers. Accordingly, researchers have no way to verify what materials are actually in the stacks, and whether their use of materials is hindered by unseen obfuscation. Given these institutional constraints, here is some practical advice for working in the archives. First, how do you locate the relevant archives and collections? A good place to start is to consult the bibliographies and citations in the relevant secondary sources on your topic. You may even want to reach out to some of the authors that you're reading to get some advice. There are also some good online directories. For example, Archive Finder includes over 200,000 collections of primary source material housed in thousands of repositories across the US, the UK, and Ireland. Likewise, Archive Collection is a collection of over 7 million archival material descriptions. Once you identify an archive, check out their website to see if they have an online catalog. Additionally, for specific collections, you may be able to access finding aids, which provide brief descriptions of the collection as well as an outline or inventory on a folder-by-folder basis. Knowing exactly what to look for before you arrive ensures that you'll be able to make the most of your visit. Additionally, you should notify the archive in advance to make sure that your desired collections are indeed available, and to get a head start on any advanced protocols. Once you get to the archives, you want to make the most of your time, especially given the fact that most archives are only open limited hours. Have a plan on getting to and from the archives, where to park, etc., as well as where to get lunch, coffee, things like that. You don't want to waste valuable time trying to figure out basic, everyday stuff. You also want to come armed with specific targets, if not specific boxes and folders identified in finding aids, then at least specific names of individuals and organizations. Once you have found your targets, then you can get lost down the rabbit holes, possibly using your leads to serendipitously discover interesting things that you may not have even been looking for. Finally, rather than pore over each document you find and taking detailed notes as you read, you may want to skim collections for what's worthwhile and photocopy them for later. It's about breadth versus depth. Most archives have photocopy machines, but they take time and cost money. A more economical and effective alternative is to take photos with a digital camera. You can even use special software that converts PIC files into searchable doc files. Either way, be sure to keep track of all box and folder numbers in order to be able to cite this work later on. So once you get the documents you need, then what do you do with them? A good place to start with source criticism is to follow Michelle Caswell's example by tracing what she calls the social life of records, which is an approach that prompts a series of questions that interrogate the knowledge power effects of sources. This begins with the creation of documentary records. We have to ask, what kind of institution or individual produced a source? With what authority? Under what circumstances? What surrounding events gave the date or the place special meaning? The individuals and organizations whose papers are deposited in archives play an important, and sometimes self-conscious, roles in helping determine what gets saved for posterity. As such, we can further ask two sets of questions. The first concerns the individual authors of sources. What was their psychological state of mind? To what extent was the author's report selective? What prejudices would have informed their account? The second set of questions concerns situational factors. Under what outside influences was the source created, especially those of higher authorities? What type of situation was involved in the creation of a source? Could the author have understood what they saw? To what extent was the author of a source influenced by the cultural and social context in which they lived? The interrogative process doesn't end there, as we also have to critically examine the action or process of selecting and organizing records in the archives. As noted earlier, archives have considerable institutional power to determine what quote-unquote counts as worthy of keeping. Curators typically accept donations contingent on having discretion to discard or return to the donors materials they deem unimportant or not appropriate to the mission of their archive. Thus, we have to ask, what is the larger mission of any particular archive? What sort of materials do they tend to collect? And what institutional biases may determine or influence what's been made available through their collections? Archivists also play an important role in imposing a sense of order on collections, as they sort through and organize deposited materials, typically by grouping them into categories and arranging them chronologically. How does this ordering frame the experience of researchers as end users of the process? In what way does framing limit the ability of researchers to find meaning and significance in the records? Finally, researchers themselves play an important role in retrieving information from the archives and disseminating them beyond the archives in the form of structured knowledge. Yet researchers hardly ever provide the full picture, as they arrive at the archives with their own specific questions, idiosyncratic interests, personal biases, things like that. And when researchers publish their findings, their citations provide leads for future researchers to follow up on the archives. Now, as helpful as these may be, we have to ask how these leads may also predispose us to seeing things a certain way. Thus, it's not uncommon to see many of the same archival papers cited over and over, while other sources in those same collections go unnoticed. Finally, both content and discourse analysis are more granular strategies for interpreting text, archival or otherwise. That is to say, you can use these methods to analyze any sort of text. And although they are different in nature, both content and discourse analysis are complementary. First, content analysis is a means of systematically, objectively, and empirically examining the message characteristics of a text. There's typically a quantitative dimension to content analysis, as it often focuses on counting how frequently words or topics were included, how much space or time was devoted to themes, and how much importance was drawn to them. Another important feature of content analysis is coding, which is a means of dividing your data into manageable segments, allowing quick access to relevant data. There's really good software out there to help with this, such as NVivo. Basically, you input your text, as well as other media files, including photos, videos, and audio, and provide a set of codes or themes used to analyze this content through queries, charts, diagrams, maps, all through a user-friendly platform that far exceeds what one could do with a pen and paper. Discourse analysis, meanwhile, is a methodology for analyzing social phenomena that is qualitative, interpretive, and constructivist, particularly in the sense that it explores how language constitutes reality. Discourse analysis is concerned with language use in social context. This goes beyond the text-based focus of content analysis on words and sentences. Instead, discourse analysis focuses on context, or all of those properties of the social situation that are relevant for the production and reception of discourse. By focusing on context, i.e., all of those things involved in communication that go unstated, such as nonverbal cues, prior knowledge, taken for granted assumptions, etc., discourse analysis involves defamiliarizing that which is usually seen as normal or natural. It provides a means of reading against the grain, of scrutinizing the dominant beliefs and attitudes that go unexamined in a text, drawing attention to the gaps, silences, and contradictions. For an accessible toolkit of discourse analysis, check out our supplementary reading by James Paul Yee, who provides a series of specific questions that you can use to interrogate your data. Okay, and that's it. We have our usual discussion forum post this week, as well as our research proposals coming up. Reach out to me with any questions. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.